My dear friends and budding historians, thank you for joining me today to talk about the Industrial Revolution. I do hope you got a chance to listen to the tune. The tune's from later, it's from the 1980s, but I feel that really captures the energy that you need to be thinking of with our Industrial Revolution today. So, um, first off, to set up what was so revolutionary about this, we need to think about what was life like before. So to sum up how things were before, people had stuff. They had sometimes very nice stuff, very nice materials, dishes, and clothing, and all the other things that you needed for life back in the 1600s and 1700s. And most of this was made locally, especially day-to-day items. So, in your local area, there was probably a brewer who made the beer. There was probably a cobbler who took care of shoes and weavers. Now, as the world kind of expanded and got more interconnected in the 1600s and 1700s, demand for more and more material things and nicer, more well-made things really skyrocketed. So there began to be an expansion of that local production into something called cottage industries. So people might still be producing things just in a village in their house. I've given you a picture there of a weaver in his house, and that they're still making whatever it is they're good at making. And it's a cottage industry in that it's produced for a bigger trade network. Right, so that weaver might have someone come to his house once a week to collect the cloth he made to bring that cloth somewhere else to make a much larger kind of clothing for sale, to sell it all the way to London or Boston or Liverpool or somewhere like that. You'll notice in the picture, everyone in the family worked. Okay, everyone works. There's none of this. Oh, the women don't work, or that the children are just having fun. Everyone worked. So even the little children, sure, they would have fun and play, but they would also be learning the industry. They would be learning what their father was doing, what their mother was doing. Even a little kid would sometimes, be brought in to hold his hands up while his mother used that to wind her yarn that she's finished spinning. By the way, the word spinster comes from the idea that back then very often the spinning job was taken on by maybe an older unmarried woman. So that's where that spinster idea comes from. This is what I'm saying when I mean everybody worked. So this is going to become important later. Okay, so we have this cottage industry and this desire for more and more things, and so that encourages people, particularly in Western Europe and the United States. It encourages people to try to make innovations to make all of this faster, easier, more efficient, more uniform, right? Because you don't want to have a bunch of cloth in the store. Some of it's great and some of it's not that great. You want everything that your people are producing to be of a uniform quality, right? So you'll notice I've given you a few key events of the Industrial Revolution. A lot of them had to do, again, with textiles. The textiles that's where the money really was. Okay. Another event tied in with this change of how the things were producing was growth of physically connecting these places better. So increasing use of turnpikes. Turnpikes are being built in England. Canals are being built in England. Eventually, there's the beginning of steamboats so that people can go on these canals even faster. And finally, your first rail cars are opened up. This is more or less, we can say that this started in Britain. The Industrial Revolution started in England, Scotland, and Wales by and large. And There's a lot of different interpretations about why this happened, but I'd suggest to you there's a convergence of factors. One is that England is very blessed with coal, and Wales also, by the way, great stores of coal. So as England became more and more deforested and a new energy source was needed, they were able to tap into that coal and use the coal in new ways. Another thing to know about Britain is they didn't have that extensive population that China and India did, and even to some extent like France did. They had high population, but they didn't have as many people who were able to work for real cheap. Okay, so there was a real incentive there to mechanize things because you could hire a guy to do whatever the job was, but if you could find a mechanical way to do it, that would be even cheaper. So there's more incentive to try out a new mechanized way to do something that used to be made by hand. We mentioned also financial institutions before. So all of that banking, credit, the Bank of England, all of those institutions made a really great environment where people could afford to invest. So a person who had gained wealth, maybe even gained the wealth through this banking system, could access that and outlay the enormous costs it would be to try out a machine, right? Or even they could get credit to borrow the money to invest in a new way of doing things, to invest in a spinning jenny, if that makes sense. Okay, and finally, there's a culture at that particular time in Britain that was a little bit more open than some other places in the world. I don't want to overstate this. Certainly, a lot of people were not allowed to participate in the more scientific and mechanical advances, right? But there was a little bit of a kind of upwardly mobile class that was really conducive to learning. There was the scientific revolution, so this culture of let's try out a mechanical thing, let's learn about it. Maybe that will help us move up in social class, so maybe I could be rewarded for taking this risk, or I could be rewarded for making this innovation. So that's a very brief overview of why the Industrial Revolution started in Britain. But all of the things I've just described are really the first Industrial Revolution. And I want to spend our last few minutes together speaking about something called the Second Industrial Revolution, which started around 1870. So this was a whole new level of what had been happening before. Now, what had been happening in the first Industrial Revolution can be characterized as using mechanical implements to increase production of things that were already around. Okay, so people already had things like textiles and clothing, and the Industrial Revolution made those be produced by machines. People already had candles, right? People already had beer that they brewed in, and so it was an introduction of more mechanized way to do things that people were already making since forever. That was the first Industrial Revolution. The second Industrial Revolution is a little different because it's characterized by brand new things that people either never really used before, or maybe it was a brand new invention that they never even heard of before, okay? So, for example, steel. Steel is your number one thing you want to associate with the Second Industrial Revolution. Second Industrial Revolution is like heavy metal, steel. Okay, steel had been around before, but it was very difficult to produce because you have to heat iron so hot that it's very difficult to actually work with it. And it's difficult to even get up to those high temperatures to begin with. So only by the 1870s were people starting to find new ways to make lots of steel in a better way. And this was new. People hadn't been making steel in large quantities before. The steel is stronger and it's also lighter than iron. It has a better tensile strength. So this can be used in brand new things that people hadn't really made before. It was used in railroads, suspension bridges, new steel-hulled ships, which would be important both for trade and for war, and even the girding in much taller buildings like skyscrapers. They couldn't build that high before until they had something as strong as steel to undergird it. Okay, what else? Electricity. So people had known about electricity much earlier. I mean, obviously there's static electricity, there's things like that, but no one had really harnessed it for a big practical use until this time period when the electromagnetic generator is invented. And I've included on your slide a photo of Nikola Tesla there with his great achievements. I didn't get a chance to speak about him much on your slides, but he's a really interesting character who your book speaks more about some of his innovations, including alternating current, which made the electricity much more pragmatic and something able to harness. Chemicals, so steel, electricity, chemicals. Chemicals people never really had used before. So new fertilizers, new explosive devices. Materials like rubber, and later plastic. So this is your second industrial revolution, brand new products that never were around before. Okay, so these new products led to more inventions that increase that connectivity. So all of those canals and turnpikes and railroads before were now able to really blossom. The railroads could be much more extensive and stronger. Automobiles could be made to go on the turnpikes, later airships, and also the connectivity of communications, right? So the telegraph, your telephone, your radio, so people are able to connect with one another in a communicative way. Okay. Your first characteristic of the second revolution is that brand new innovations, your steel, your electricity, your chemicals. That's your second industrial revolution. The other characteristic that's a little different has to do with politics, in that during the second industrial revolution, there's much more competition between the different nations. Your first industrial revolution was kind of almost all about Britain. Obviously, the other countries were involved, but Britain was just leading the pack. That all changes already by the 1850s, 1860s. Everyone else is getting in on the act. The United States in particular has an enormous boom. Germany has a huge boom. So it's really competitive. And going along with that competition, it's worth noting that a lot of these new technologies were technologies of war. All of those explosives, for example, were used to make things like dynamite. Technologies like rubber used for equipment, and steel, particularly importantly, steel used in artillery and guns. Okay, the second industrial revolution really changed the way people live. Well, the Industrial Revolution as a whole, it increased the percentage of people who lived in cities, so cities grew massively. It also moved people around to new places, so the 19th century and the early 20th century saw a big uptick in people migrating, particularly out of Europe to the rest of the world. It changed the way people thought about time. So in our old cottage industry, if we could go back to that family who was all working together to make some cloth, they might have a deadline to meet, and they would need to produce a certain amount of cloth maybe by the end of the week, every week, or maybe by every Friday, maybe by the end of the month. But within that time frame, they could figure it out however they wanted. It's a little bit like an online class, right? With an online class, the way an asynchronous class like ours is run, you have some tasks that you are supposed to do, and I leave it to you. You figure out when's the best time for you to do your reading. You feel like reading at 2 a.m.? Wonderful, go for it. So that's a little more like a cottage industry type. It's very independent. It's not very closely monitored, right? You're kind of just, as long as you get that end result out, that's all the boss or the person who wants your cottage industry fabric wants. Similar to other industries at the time, so for example with farming, when you're a farmer you make hay while the sun shines, meaning you work when the work needs to be done. So people were a little more, less conscious of things like work hours. They worked from sun up to sundown when it was a season to do so. In the winter, you might have a lot of downtime. You might just be sharpening your tools and things. Industrialization fundamentally changes that. So people are much more conscious of time. They work in factories. They tend to be working for an hourly wage or a day wage rather than based on the amount of things they're able to produce. And because in the industrialization they tend to be working in factories, all of this is much more scrutinized and supervised what you're doing. And you have efficiency experts like a man called Taylor who studied this and worked out ways that these new factories could get even more things produced. Okay, so that's a little bit more like an in-person college class experience where we're meeting together in person and the professor's there scrutinizing what you're doing, and you're there for a certain amount of time. Okay, so this also changes people's relationship to what labor is, particularly true of laborers who worked in factories. Now, unfortunately, a lot of small children worked in mines and factories in the first days of the Industrial Revolution. And I want to go back to what I was saying about the cottage industry where everybody worked. That's why it was considered acceptable to send your child out to work, because children had always been a part of your household economy. Women were always working in the household to help whatever needed to get done to be produced. So in some ways it was a big change to have women going out somewhere else to work or children going outside of the home to work, but it was also a continuity with the past where everyone in the family contributes. Okay. But if you work in a factory, you don't actually tend to own your own tools. You certainly don't own the machines. So this is called not owning the means of production. And it leads to a system where the workers are alienated from the items they produce. So there's not that sense of pride. There's not that sense of I made this that you get when you craft something. There's not that craftsmanship pride. And so the alienation comes back up when the factory workers are dissatisfied. Okay, so as I was kind of suggesting with what I last said, there was a lot of pushback against industrialization. Certainly there was pushback against having children, in particular in the factories, and there was pushback for everyone to be working excessive hours. So politically, there were eventually laws passed to work on the hours worked, safety conditions, things like that. A lot of that pushback of the health and welfare of workers was done by the workers themselves through different kinds of unions or through their activities with political groups like the British Chartists. Culturally, we see pushback in the early Industrial Revolution, way back in the start of the Industrial Revolution, in something called the Romantic movement. The Romantic movement, which sought to escape this growing mechanization of life It sought to escape all the buildings and the pollution, and it looked towards something natural, something emotive. So when we talk about the romantic movement in the arts, just to be careful, it doesn't mean like necessarily like a love story. Like today when we say romantic, we kind of mean like, two people in love. That's not. I mean, the romantic movement will have that, but the romantic movement was a more all-encompassing any kind of emotion. So the zeal, the emotion of being out in nature, the passion that you might have for an idea, so things like that. So that's a bigger meaning of the word romantic, if you take my drift. So, for example, the poetry of Wordsworth is romantic poetry. The music of Beethoven, particularly in his later period, is romantic. Goethe's plays and novels are considered romantic novels. I also mentioned Shelley there. Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein is considered a Gothic novel, but it has its origins in Romanticism, so it shows kind of a transition, or it shows the connection between this romantic energy of the natural wonders and emotion into the Gothic, which is kind of the dark side of humanity in the novel Frankenstein. All right, so we mentioned the workers were not always having a great time, and one of the ways to address this was called socialism. Now, you want to be really careful here because there are many different kinds of socialism back then and today. So socialism doesn't automatically necessarily mean one thing. The basic idea of all socialist movements is that material things need to be distributed in such a way as to maximize human welfare. Okay, that's kind of a general idea of like what is socialism. It means that stuff, our things need to be distributed in a positive way. Okay, so that doesn't necessarily mean communism. For example, a lot of your first socialist groups base their socialism on the teachings of Jesus, right? So they looked toward things like the Beatitudes and they said, oh, we need to do what he's saying and, give everyone the bread and the loaves and the fishes, right? So there were Christian socialist groups. There were lots of different socialist groups that had different ideas of how material goods needed to be distributed. They all agreed that what was happening with industrialization is it was not being distributed, that all the material things were going to the elites. That the labor of the people was being used to create wealth and material comfort for the elites, and all the socialists agreed that something more even needed to be made. But one socialist in particular, more famous than all the others, was Karl Marx, who was originally from Germany and moved to England. And based on what he saw in factories in England and also his research and his talks with his friend Friedrich Engels, who also co-authored some of the texts, he came up with an idea of a socialism that was atheistic, and it was based on an idea that the factory workers, or what he called the proletariat, that these factory workers were the ones who should be in charge and dictating how that distribution should look. Okay, so Marx says these factory workers need to be in charge of the government. They need to be the ones figuring out how do we distribute our material goods. Okay, and this, he worked very hard at these ideas. He researched them a great deal. My understanding is he was not himself a worker, and I believe it because anyone who's actually worked an 8-hour day knows that after an 8-hour day of work, you're probably a little too tired at the end of the day to do something like running a country. So that's my main problem with Marx, is I think that aspect of administrating a community is not really well thought out. That's just my personal interpretation. But there's all kinds of things wrong with Marxist idea, and we'll hear more about that when we talk about the Russian Revolution, where they took Marxist ideas and ran with them. Thank you so much for joining me today.